Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining Japan Foundation London's online event. My name is Junko Takekawa, Senior Arts Program Officer of Japan Foundation London. Having worked in Japan-related culture sector in the UK, I have been in the fortunate and privileged position of getting to know the trend in theatre production, particularly when they have something to do with Japan. Partly because bringing a theatre production from Japan is a costly business for some, and mostly because the world is getting smaller and the more exchanges between professionals in the UK and Japan have been made. I believe UK-Japan close collaboration by bringing ideas from both countries could be the way forward in creating Japan-related productions. Of course, I've seen a number of theatre productions, if not too many, in the UK where existing Japanese plays were translated into English and staged for the UK. But the matter I'm more intrigued about is the way production is set up by sourcing Japanese materials from other media and transforming it into a UK stage play. This is today's focus of the discussion, and this is our first time to explore the related issues. For this roundtable discussion, I am delighted to welcome 5 distinguished panelists focusing on Japanese narratives for the UK stage. They are Franco Figueiredo, the co-founder and artistic director of Stone Crabs Theatre Company, Jeremy Herring, award-winning theatre director and the director of Afterlife, which is currently on the National Theatre, Ichikawa Yojiro, artistic director of the UK theatre company, Theatre Lapis, with strengths in musical theatre, Alexander Rutter, the founder and the director of the UK theatre company, Whole Hog, but who currently lives in Japan. This round-table discussion will be chaired by Professor Kenneth Rie, who teaches at Guildhall School of Music and Drama, but is also an actor, director, and theatre critic. Thank you all for sparing your precious time. I especially thank Alex for joining us despite the time difference. In Japan, it is now 2:30 a.m. As each will introduce themselves in relation with Japan, I won't go through the detail, but I know each has taken a unique approach to Japanese material. I look forward to hearing a live debate from them. By the way, please note that Jack, whose initial panel is unfortunately not possible to take part today. Next, housekeeping matters. Today's event will be recorded. As we are using the webinar function, your names will not be viewable by other attendees. However, I strongly recommend you to keep your audio and video muted throughout, just in case. If you have any question for the panelists, please use the Q&A function to send in your question at any time. You can see the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Remember, the attendee's question may be seen by everyone else, so that if you can upvote a particular question placed by another person which you would like answered, or if it's the same as yours, simply click the thumb up icon next to the question you wish to upvote. Unfortunately, due to time restrictions, we may not be able to pick up all of the questions you asked, so my apologies in advance. Lastly, as always, we will send you an online questionnaire, so please spare a short moment to complete it for a future event. That's all from me. Now I'd like to hand it over to Kenneth and then other panelists to start roundtable discussion. Over to you.
Thank you, Junko. Good evening, everyone. Japanese culture has for a long time held an important influence on Western theatre. It's inspired writers such as Benjamin Britten, Bertolt Brecht, Tennessee Williams, and directors such as Peter Brook, Ariane Mnouchkine, Lindsay Kemp, Meyerhold, Jean-Louis Barrault, even George Lucas, who apparently was a great fan of Kurosawa. And at the same time, Western theatre has inspired landmarks of modern Japanese theatre, from directors such as Yukio Ninagawa or Shuji Terayama, just to name a couple. It's an incredibly rich cross-fertilization that draws on long and powerful traditions to make us see theatre in a new light. Now, this evening, we'll hear from 4 directors who have, in very different ways, drawn on aspects of Japanese culture in their own work. Before I introduce them to you, I should explain where I'm coming from. As an actor and director in New Zealand, I had a long fascination with traditions such as kabuki and no theatre, and I made my first visit to Japan in the late 70s to study all aspects of a modern and traditional Japanese theatre. As a journalist, I've since written about Japanese theatre for The Guardian, The Times, and The Sunday Times. And with my own company in Britain, Jet Theatre, I also produced two Kyogen traditional comedy plays. And currently, I'm Professor of Theatre at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama. So, to our panel. To start with, I'd like to ask each of you to explain for us the attraction of Japanese culture for you and how you've used it in your work. First, Alex Rotta, you're based in Japan and you're involved in a lot of Anglo-Japanese collaborations. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm a director and producer, and I'm based in Tokyo with Whole Hog Theatre and Nelke Planning, where I specialize in creating Anglo-Japanese collaborations. And I've been working with Japanese source material and in particular anime for the past 8 years. And I relocated to Tokyo 5 years ago as part of the Daiwa Scholarship. Next slide, please. So for Whole Hog Theatre, I am co-founder and artistic director, and I initially focused on new adaptations from European source material, but this all changed after staging Princess Mononoke in 2013, and we now focus on Japanese source material. Next slide, please. I work mainly with emerging Japanese, British East Asian and British Southeast Asian artists, and our work is hugely collaborative. It aims to encourage diversity, bring new audiences to the theatre and challenge stereotypes, particularly about Japan. And as you can see, we focus on visual storytelling using ensemble, movement and puppetry to transcend language barriers. Next slide, please. So I'm also a resident director at Nelke Planning, a leading Japanese producer and pioneer of 2.5 dimensional theatre, which is a unique genre emerging from Japan. And it brings manga, anime, and video games to the stage with titles such as Naruto, Demon Slayer, Sailor Moon, you name it, they've done it. And the example here is Magia Record from the Madoka Magica franchise, starring idol group Keyakizaka 46, and for which I was creative director. And in addition to 2.5D shows, I actually also adapt and direct British stories for the Japanese stage. Next slide, please. So here are some examples of shows staged both in the UK and Japan, which I directed or collaborated on. It all started with Princess Mononoke, based on the renowned anime and the world's first stage production of any Hayao Miyazaki film. The Key was an award-winning site-specific opera composed and directed by Francesca Lilloe and based on the novella by Junichiro Tanizaki. And in 2020, we were due to stage The Garden of Words, based on the anime by Makoto Shinkai and Comics Wave Films. Next slide, please. But unfortunately, The Garden of Words has been delayed due to the pandemic, but I'll leave you with some images of our research and development workshop, and we really hope to bring this to stage in the near future. So watch this space, and I can't wait to get talking about your question, Ken.
Thank you, Alex. Now, Yoichiro Ichikawa is a Japanese director working mainly in Britain, and through Theatre Lapis, you've adapted Japanese stories and folk tales for audiences here. Can you tell us a little about those?
Sure. So I'm the artist director of the theater company Theatre Lapis, and then we've been working on some Japanese culture related productions. So I'm going to show you some pictures from them. So the first image here is from the show Vichinanki, which was produced by Polish theater in Vidokoshev. It's quite difficult to pronounce the name, Vidokoshev, which subsequently transferred to New National Theatre Tokyo. So the show is devised based on the folk art in both countries, commonly used in paper. So in Japan, it's origami. In Poland, it's vichinanki, which is cutouts. The production was celebrating the 100th anniversary year of the diplomatic relationship between the two countries. So next slide, please. This is Puran Dagger, which was co-produced by Japan Foundation. So this show is a musical based on the folk tale, which was not commonly known by Japanese people either, but like that was discovered by a British anthropologist. So we created this musical in collaboration with British artists, and then we casted East Asian artists. To balance out, to keep the authenticity and also to keep the balance between the Western and the Eastern culture. Okay, next slide, please. So this show is Ondine by Jean Giraudoux, French playwright. This production was created in a collaboration with East 15 Acting School. And so even though the story is taking place in Europe, we fused it with Japanese cultural essence and materials in terms of visual and in terms of the staging, using lots of techniques from Japanese traditional theaters to make it more multicultural. Next slide, please. So this show is The Red Candle, based on a novel written by Mimei Ogawa, a very famous Japanese novelist. So we used Bunraku-style puppetry in this show and also fused lots of skills and techniques from physical theater to create it to more intercultural production. And also we made it a kind of like site-specific production taking place in a tunnel, like going underneath the river from Victorian era. Next slide, please. So we Turtle Lapis, our aim is to challenge the boundaries between the conventional boundaries between genres and cultures, and create something new out of merging these different things together. Thank you.
Thank you, Yojiro. And Franco Figueiredo is artistic director of Stone Crabs Theatre. Franco, you seem to be bringing Japanese theatre and world theatre to Britain. Would that be true? You're on mute.
Thank you. So yeah, we are very much interested in exploring breaking form theater. Stone Crabs we work towards placing underrepresented voices and untold stories center stage. So we have been working in Anglo-Japanese collaborations since 2004. I mean, the photograph that you see there is of a production that we did, Buzu and the Damask Drum, where we experimenting with our dance and Rakugo. Darian, can I have the next slide, please? So that's kind of like there's still part of is a transition from Buzu and the masked drum. And the next slide, please. In 2009, we did a production, Hanjo and Harry Screen, at Overhouse for the 50th anniversary of the UK-Japan relations celebrations. And in 2008, we presented The Assault Kiss, which is a Brazilian story in which we work in a co-production with One Two Works. Is the next slide, please, Darian? Yes. In a collaboration with Seneza at Outspot Theatre in Tokyo. There was a collaboration between 3 companies. Very exciting, presenting a Brazilian story in translation in the UK stage with a UK, Brazilian, and Japanese collaboration. And currently we are working with Buzu Theatre on a new production inspired by tales of loneliness and yokai stories, which unfortunately has been stopped because of the pandemic, but we are working on a hybrid format and hopefully we'll come to something in August. But that's a little bit about us.
Thank you, Franco. And Jeremy Herron is known for his work with the Royal Shakespeare Company and the National Theatre. Jeremy, you've just opened Afterlife at the National, and it's based on a Japanese film, isn't it? Tell us a little bit about it.
Thanks, Ken. Yes, it's a famous film by Hirokazu Kore-eda. Please pick me up on my pronunciation, somebody. I think in Japanese, the literal translation is "Wonderful Life." And it's a film that I saw a few years ago, and it was proposed to me by the designer, Bunny Christie, who thought that the show would make an excellent piece of work. And she brought it to me at my previous company, a theatre company called Headlong, which is a touring company that works in partnership with various organizations. And one of the missions at Headlong is to explore the boundaries of form and content and engage with the world and with the human condition through theatre. And Afterlife felt like a really great opportunity to work collaboratively with Bunny as a designer and Jack Thorne, the writer. And over a few years in collaboration with the National Theatre, we took the mechanism and the feeling behind Kore-eda's film and slowly made it our own. So it's a respectful and rather loose adaptation. I suppose we wanted to respond to the central narrative mechanism, which is an idea about what happens when you die. You enter into some seemingly bureaucratic space and you have 1 week to decide on a memory that is going to be recreated for you and allow you to pass through into eternity, taking only that one memory with you. And we thought this was such a great way of thinking about, not death exactly, a great way of thinking about life. If you can only take one memory, what does that say about your life and the choice that you make? And it's really, even though it's set after you die, it's really a play about what happens when you live and what's important to you. And you know, we just made it full of love and respect for Kore-eda's work. I happen to be a great fan of his stuff, but there's something generous about the narrative mechanism that allowed it to be translated for contemporary Britain. And I hope we've been successful in that way.
Yes, indeed. Yes, in a way, all of you are adapting Japanese stories, some from different media, and it's an interesting question, isn't it? How you keep true to the spirit of the story, of the original, and yet make it believable and relevant for a British audience. You know, in other words, how much Japanese-ness should an adaptation have? Yojiro, you've been doing this a lot with your myths and legends. How do you go about it?
Sure. The thing is that, so whenever I devise a show based on Japanese folk tales, it's just like we will try to find the universal themes and messages in it, so that like we still can keep the authenticity in terms of like philosophy and like mentality of Japanese people appearing in the story, but at the same time, it is relevant enough for the audience. So, and also one of the most important things in the process of devising it is that like we always have a discussion inviting people from European culture into our workshop, like not only actors, but also like creatives, so like we can merge different perspectives together to create a show.
And Franco, for example, you also did some of Yukio Mishima's 5 modern no plays. Now, there was a writer who was also very influenced, Japanese writer, influenced very much by Western culture, trying to use tradition in a modern way in the 1950s. How did you go about this, of finding a particular world for those plays?
I think the world was there already. It's just what that which what attracts you, right? Is that, you know, the key. You know, I mean, I think with the Japanese drama, there is a quiet. It's kind of a quiet epic. For me, I mean, with Mishima, it's really interesting because with Mishima, he's already adapting. He's adapting from the no, from the Kyogene, from the Kabuki into a kind of Western way of playwriting. So he worked very close with Donald Keane, you know, to get the plays translated in, and he was really keen in having those plays produced in the US in the 1950s. So when I was working with that material, I was already like working from an adaptation. So the plays were very, they are miniatures of like of epics, but the imagery is so inspirational that it's not too hard to bring it to the contemporary, you know, day, you know, to now. I mean, like from the 1950s to now, you know, you don't have to make many changes. But what I love most is the fantasy and the fantastic, you know, the dreams, all the symbolism that he brings, he still brings from the Noi, from the Kabuki into those contemporary plays.
So there's something universal in that.
Completely, yeah.
And Jeremy, in your cast of 12, you had 2 Japanese actors, and there didn't seem to be an attempt to create a specifically authentic Japanese world. It was quite universal. And yet there was something about the play, the structure, the philosophy, the feeling of it that was distinctly Japanese. You know, some people I spoke to afterwards mentioned, or it reminded them of Shinto, you know, ideas of death and rebirth and that. Was that something you set about trying to create, or is it just our imagination? We're seeing a Japaneseness in that.
I suppose it was maybe inbuilt in Kore-eda's structure. I mean, during part of the workshop process, I forget his name now, but we spoke to a very engaging Japanese doctor of philosophy who gave us a wonderful rundown of the spiritual tradition and how afterlife would relate to that. And the liberating news was that it related to it in a very non-specific way, which freed us up, because I was always very conscious about not, you know, the flip side of this conversation, and I suppose we've all dealt with it in certain ways, is notions of appropriation, of just taking a kind of gestural surface idea of a culture that one might not fully understand and exploiting it for optics or, you know, surface aesthetics or sensibilities that aren't really felt through. And it felt very important for me artistically, but for, you know, the company Headlong and the National Theatre not to be in the business of appropriating anything, so that all of those choices felt authentic. So, you know, if any of those traces remain, then I suppose it's in the baked into Kore-eda's structure. We certainly consciously didn't try to copy anything or take something that we didn't fully understand. And yet it did feel important to acknowledge the progeny of the story. And so as part of a you know, mixed lists, as they say, in terms of our casting process, we met a wonderful actor called Togo Ogawa to play one of the older characters, Hirokazu Mochizuki, and as a result, we had to cast his younger self. So we cast another younger Japanese male actor, and that felt like a nice gesture towards the progeny without making us, on the one hand, guilty of appropriation, but also making sure that part of our team could talk to any Japanese issues that came up.
Yeah.
As it was, he played a character that had, like the actor himself, had relocated from Tokyo 43 years ago and had lived in England and had, married an English woman and brought a family up with mixed heritage. So that all felt appropriate.
And you also had that, then somebody who had that living Japanese sensibility there in the room, in the rehearsal room. And it's interesting, some of the younger British actors talked about working with him, with Togo, that he had such a dignity and grace and complete lack of ego serving the play, which they felt was very different to the Western approach of a lot of actors, which is a me, am I getting it right?
Yeah.
And they found that very inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, I would hazard a guess that isn't only a Japanese quality, but it's certainly one that he has as a man in spades. He's very he's a wonderful human being and a brilliant actor.
We'll come back to that, Alex. How you've encountered that, because you're working a lot of the time with Japanese actors, albeit often with young actors, highly physical in adapting different genres. What do you find?
With regards to authenticity
the sensibility and how you get through, how you connect with Japanese actors as a director?
Well, that's been a very exciting journey for me, because when I first came to Japan, I didn't speak any Japanese, and my first production that I was directing, I occasionally just didn't have a translator, so had to get by on what I knew. But I actually was very grateful for that experience, because what it did is it allowed me to really test myself to speak with them in their language and try and work out how I can communicate even without having my Japanese anywhere near the level it should be possible to direct a room full of Japanese actors. But it was I also learned, as much as I was working with them to teach them new skills, like puppetry in theatre, for example, here is quite rare in the way that we now understand it in the UK. As much as I was teaching them, they were teaching me those nuances, and working really collaboratively is such a joy in that sense, because it allowed me to get a better insight into their approach to it, and they actually built a relationship with me which allowed them to say, do you know what, that's not how we would do it, or this doesn't really make sense in Japanese. Like in English maybe it does, but to me it just wouldn't happen. There was we've in a production I did of Tristan and Isolde, which was obviously a British text in Japan, and then in Japanese there was some cutting from one scene to another, and we found that the actor just didn't know how to actually deliver the grammar when you cut it off mid-sentence, and there was just such a huge amount to learn. But I would say that authenticity is hugely important, and so I think it's a wonderful experience to be able to work with those actors and hear their feedback.
And this also leads to the question of genres, because some of you are working, adapting different genres. Jeremy, a film, and Alex, you are fascinated with what you might call 2.5D theatre from manga, comics, anime, and even video games. And when you see that on stage, there's this amazing burst of energy from these young acrobatic people. Does one genre adapt very well, efficiently to another, to theatre? Can video games make good theatre?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's worth bearing in mind that often manga and anime is seen as a genre, I think, perhaps in the West, rather than a medium, because there's a sort of stereotype that comes with manga and anime that goes way back, or it's a bit violent, or it's only for kids. And obviously we're way sort of past those stereotypes in a way, but I think that there's parts of them that still persist. So it's important to remember that in that sense, as a medium, any manga or anime could be fantastic for stage, the same with a video game. But I would say it always depends exactly on what the source material is. So in terms of how well something adapts, I think that's where the choice of what to adapt comes in. And, you know, I think all the examples we've heard about so far seem like they have a real way to grow and develop and actually enhance understanding by being on the stage. And I think anime and manga in particular actually have an opportunity to diversify audiences, because it might bring in people who don't actually necessarily go to the theatre anyway. So it's yeah, I think there's no limits in that sense. It's all about what you choose to adapt.
And Jeremy, what about film? Because often people level the criticism that, oh, adapting a film on stage is never as good as the original, it's a waste of time. I mean, was that something you considered, or do you
considered it being a waste of time? Yes, I mean, on a daily basis, yeah. Is this a massive waste of time, everybody? Yeah. I suppose, you know, you've got to, I think Alex makes a really good point. I think for me, it's about what's underneath the film. I mean, I certainly think, you know, when you get into the business of adapting things for commercial reasons because they've got a famous title, is that you've got to, you know, you've got to work harder, I think, to find something that has an artistic, emotional, thematic engine underneath it that's going to sustain. Otherwise, you get a certain advance at the box office from the fans of that film, but actually they turn up and they realize exactly why it was a film and why it shouldn't have been adapted. So I think, yes, the pressure is absolutely on. And I think you've got to think, well, what can the stage do that film doesn't? Or what can the stage do that a video game doesn't? How can we augment people's relationship with this fantastic thing? And you know, having done a few novel adaptations and a film adaptation into a musical, and then now this film adaptation into a piece of theatre, you know, it was always really important to say, we're not running away from theatre. We're actually bringing towards theatre. And in a way, what's exciting about a film structure is that you go, well, it's not obvious how to replicate this in terms of our dramatic narrative structure. What's important? How do we maintain a flow? How do we sustain the scenes? How do we use dialogue to translate and prosecute the characters' journeys? And in that effort, you end up making it your own and making it your own statement. The thing that I should say about Afterlife is the way, for those of you that don't know the film, the way that people's memories in Kore-eda's film is that their memories are delivered to them via the medium of film. And so, you know, from very early on in our process, that we took a different view, which was, we're creating this as a piece of theatre. So we're going to make people's memories through the medium of theatre. So part of our evening is about recruiting the clients, the guided, to understand that theatre isn't about simple mimetic replication. It's about finding the essence of a feeling or the essence of an idea and communicating that economically. And structurally, over the course of the evening, we have the plot and the characters and we have their development, but we also are educating the audience into what makes a piece of theatre and how powerful a small theatre gesture can be with all departments working together. So I would hope that in the way that Kore-eda's Afterlife is a love letter to film, that our show is a love letter to theatre, and that is a translation and an adaptation of his work that I hope he would appreciate and understand.
That rethinking of the story then must be very liberating as well, because it throws you back on, as you say, the resources of theatre, what you can do.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, we know, I'm sure everybody on this panel understands that all the challenges that we face on a daily basis in our creative lives eventually become opportunities. And it certainly was the case for us.
Yeah. And Yojiro, you've been looking at stories, myths, legends, and that sometimes these are epic and huge. Do they adapt very well to the stage?
Yes, I think so, because it's just like, no matter how big the story is, what we need in theater is like the messages to the humanity itself. So like, even if the story itself is, the scale of the story is big, like we just need to compress it to the space. However, like we can use our imagination and the creativity to make it work in a theatrical way, so that like so that the audience can just dive into that world using their imagination, and then just with the communication between the actors on the stage and the audience, like we can just like find this like really beautiful world that can be only created in theater. That's what I believe.
Mm-hmm. And also, Frank, I'm thinking with your approach to so many different cultures you're looking at from around the world, how do you bring those to life? How do you approach those? And I just wonder if has that changed your way of working? Has it had an effect on you that you see theatre in a different way?
Well, it's all up to me. It's all about the storytelling. And then I started with that to think, so okay, we have this story to tell, and we are 7 of us, maybe from different cultures, from different countries, and we all working together to tell that story, which is maybe from a particular culture, but that's not the culture at the moment. Is not the focus. Is the story that is the focus for me. I started with all the focus of being the story, and then who's telling that story, and together we always try to find a new way in the rehearsal room. We always experimenting with new forms. We always trying to, we often work with a community of actors, which involves like actors that we worked with before and new actors that are coming into the work with us. So there is a merge of ideas. There's ideas that let's try something new. Let's exchange ideas as well. So for instance, when we were doing Buzu and the Damask drum, one of the things we really wanted to explore was the connection with the audience through the Awa dance folklore. And I was just very we were in it was summer in Japan. We were over there in the middle rehearsals, and it happened to be the Awa festival, and we're just fascinated with the whole spectacle that our dance folklore had, visually, but also the narrative that they were carrying through, that that kind of burlesque kind of performance on the streets. And we started kind of like experiment with the movements that they were doing and how those movements could tell a story on the stage. So we're trying to experiment with that, and also with the Rakugo, which is the kind of like storytelling with fans, which is basically like, this is not a chair, what is this, so it's like transforming the fun into various different kind of objects, and finding a way to tell the story in a very simple way. So for me, it always comes from the story, what the story you're trying to tell, and who is there with me to tell that story. So I mean, like we work in so many, in our Anglo-Japanese productions, we tend to work very very close with the Japanese actors, in the UK, the Japanese actors in the UK and Japanese actors in Tokyo, which is the connection that we have. So that for us, that would be the storytellers for me, and so we're always borrowing from them.
Just looking at the pictures you all showed us at the beginning, it seems that color is a really important part of Japanese theatre. Would that be true? Anyone say anything about that? Alex, for example, there's your productions are very, very colorful, striking contrasts and lighting.
Yes, I think there's definitely a difference in style between sort of the British theatre tastes, I would say, and the Japanese theatre taste. I remember the first production we brought here, which was Princess Mononoke. We had endless creative discussions and debates about how bright and how colorful the lighting should be. And you'll find in 2.5D productions, they're trying to they are actually trying to recreate the original animes if it's jumped right out the page. So the colors have to be right, the wigs have to be exactly the same shade as the original anime, and that's part of the joy for those audiences. So I would say that yeah, some of the productions very much reflect that color, but perhaps there's a slight mutedness that is sometimes preferred elsewhere. But yeah, I think it is an important element, certainly from a Japanese producer's point of view, and that's an interesting debate to have between Britain and Japan.
Anyone else? Yojiro, would that be true for you?
Yeah, so I think it's more about the balance between light and shadow rather than what kind of color palette we use, I believe, because it's just like we have this really neat sense about that balance. So that like because from Japanese perspective, we feel serenity and calmness like somewhere in between these two things. So it should not be so bright in terms of like making it more authentic, in my opinion. Well, this is something different in anime world, obviously, because like in anime, like it's so bright and so colorful. It's just totally different thing. But like really traditional way of thinking as a Japanese person, I would say it's the things should not be so bright in terms of lighting. It's just like we have to make it calm and serene, and then just there's this really fine balance about it.
And Jeremy, I'm just thinking in Afterlife, the significance of the red dress has a great impact, you know, in that scene, and the blossom, you know, the use of color.
Absolutely. You know, again, I don't think that feels like us trying to be particularly Japanese. It's about moving from the bureaucracy and the monochrome nature of, you know, the moment of death through the passing through. And so we saved a lot of saturation until later in the show. You know, that was a kind of the design choice that I don't think I've done it exactly like that before, but it's certainly, you know, one of the weapons that you can use in order to immerse an audience. Incidentally, the cherry blossom effect that we had at the end of Afterlife came directly from the film. One of the characters talks about cherry blossom as being one of their memories, and it was really wonderful to lean on some of the expertise at the National Theatre, who had worked with Ninagawa on his famous productions. So there was a lovely kind of symmetry about us trying to create this effect and referring back to these amazing cherry blossom effects that he had when I think he brought King Lear, his production of King Lear, over. So anyway, that felt like an incidental moment, and you'll have to tell me whether that is a particularly specific Japanese quality, but it certainly worked for the story.
I certainly thought of Ninagawa, yes, there, but it's such an obvious, you know, and Japanese thing to have, isn't it? Cherry blossom falling.
Someone on our chat is Vicky Island is just saying that it's the Scottish play.
Yes, it was, yeah. We've got a question coming in from Emma. She says, adding to Akiko's question, how do you feel about bilingual productions? Have you ever, any of you, used surtitles, or do you prefer to avoid them? Would anyone like to answer that? Yeah, Alex?
So I've done sort of all versions, if you like. I've taken a piece in English and used subtitles. I've also done sort of what would you say, sister production, so a Japanese version and a English version of the same production, and also worked on a production where both English and Japanese texts were actually incorporated into the fabric of each performance. And again, I think it probably depends on the adaptation you're working on and the audience that you are presenting it to. But I do think there's something wonderful about challenging yourself to see what elements of Japanese text you can include. So for example, with The Garden of Words, we're definitely, it's a play in English in the UK and it will be in Japanese in Japan, but we are trying to work out what phrases or sounds we can include from Japanese to give you a sense of the sound of Japan without losing the meaning. And it's a real challenge, but it's really an exciting way of doing it. And I would say that when you take a very complicated piece and use surtitles, you're extremely limited to the shape and size of the surtitle board and where it is in the theatre. I know on the chat, Helen McCarthy's mentioned the production of Pluto at the Barbican, and that is such a complex story that I think it's very difficult in that scenario for an audience to read everything they need to on a subtitle board. But in something a bit simpler, maybe a children's production, it wouldn't matter. Children's production not so much, but something simpler maybe wouldn't matter so much. But there's a huge amount of conversation about what you lose in translation, I think.
Mm-hmm. And just picking up with Vicky Island's question about the needs of children are so rarely included in conversations like this. Is Japan, this maybe Alex, you would know about this, is Japan better at providing and inspiring young people, children, than we do here in Britain?
I wouldn't say it's better. I think it's just there's a different sort of understanding of childhood, I think, and what's wonderful about Japanese culture is that there doesn't seem to be quite as much of a barrier to how you're appreciating it. It's quite normal for plenty of adults to read a comic and enjoy that, and same with animation, which I think is also true in the West, but it's a nice sort of space there, so you can cross that boundary between what's an adult content and what's a children's content. But I guess I wouldn't say it's better, it's just a different understanding of it. Yeah.
Anything you were finding, Yojiro, because you're sometimes doing stories for children?
Yeah, so it's just like in Japan, there's no tradition. I mean, like no big tradition. There's no big tradition to taking children to theater so much. So I mean, like in this country, you have this beautiful tradition of panto here, like every single year, like you take whole family, you go with your whole family to theater to see a show. However, in Japan, yes, there are several kind of like theater companies which do shows just solely for children. However, it's really, really small market. So that's one of the problems we're having in the theater industry in Japan. It's just like we don't develop in ourselves the tradition to go to theater so much. So we tend to think that like theater is just for rich people sometimes, or like people who only have time, like enough time to go to, I mean, like enough time to kill. And so it's just like, that's the problem that we don't have. That's actually like one of the reasons that we don't have this like proper established institutions to train actors as well, I believe. So I mean, like that question is actually quite relevant to what we're experiencing at the moment.
This is the training, because there aren't conventional drama schools in Japan, are there, in the way we would have them in Britain?
No.
And a lot of the time, directors have told me they have to be responsible for training the actors themselves. Have
Exactly.
you found that? Yeah.
Yes, sometimes. Yes. Well, the thing is that because the way they cast people to shows, it's like mainly star casting. So like they always bring in people from TVs and movies, like who can just sell enough tickets for the producers to recoup the show. It's just like, however, not necessarily these people are trained to act in theater. That's why, I mean, like from the perspective of producers, like how they can sell the tickets are more important than what, I mean, like how good quality they can create from their productions. And then the problem is that the audience in Japan, they are so used to that kind of casting system. So they tend to go to shows to see actors rather than the show itself. So it's just like, the problem is just like going on and on as a loop. Like I'm like we don't know where to fix it. do you mean? Like where to start with? Where to start to fix all these kind of things going on?
And Alex, that happens with these anime adaptations, doesn't it? I mean, where do these actors come from? I mean, they're full of energy, bouncing around on the stage and looking like young pop stars. Where are they coming from?
Well, a lot of them are young pop
see.
stars. In fact, there's an increasing trend. So to build on what Yojiro said, there's an increasing trend for idols to be cast in shows. And although idols sort of technically sing and dance, they're very much manufactured stars, and they're often very, very young. And so they have no acting experience whatsoever. And so and also a lot of the idol groups, whilst they have their individual characters, they're often dressed, the costumes are very similar, or they're dressed quite the same, whereas in an anime, sort of the individual characteristics are quite different. And so there's definitely I've had a lot of experience with that. And it's an interesting challenge for me, because when you're working with young actors who are sort of, they'll be with like an office rather than a school, and they'll sort of have an agent, and it's quite restrictive. So it's wonderful to have a chance to actually be in a room and teach actors for someone like me, because that's sort of something I'm passionate about, is bringing up young performers. But it's very difficult when they actually have been sort of drafted in from a big agency somewhere, and they have no concept of theatre and maybe no intention of ever acting. So it's a really challenging space.
What's that like to work with?
It's difficult to be creative with that, but I would say that the actors I've worked with who don't have much experience, and they're not idols and they're not pop stars, they are actually extremely willing to learn, and they're very, very excited about that process. So that was actually a complete joy, working with Japanese actors and getting their feedback. But the idol, the pop stars, that kind of area of it is I think more challenging for a director.
We're talking here about working with different cultures. And when you work on a play that's coming from a different culture, you get to know that story and that world intimately, because you have to delve right into it. I just wonder for each of you, if in any way that has changed the way you work, your approach to how you see theatre, what you can do, your philosophy of theatre. Has anything rubbed off on you as an experience of working with Japanese theatre? Jeremy, I wonder for you, because you were coming to a Japanese story for the first time on a practical level, weren't you?
Yes, and because of that, I've had engagement with certain actors, and this conversation, and I've had a long-standing offer from a theatre in Tokyo that I've never managed to organise the dates for, but I'm determined to make something happen, because I think it would just be a fascinating and illuminating and wonderful for my own development as an artist. So I'm determined to take that up, and it's been an entirely positive engagement with it, and it's been a collaboration with Kore-eda. It'd be nice to go and knock on his door and say thank you very much.
And Franco, what about you?
Can I just say something about the question before? Because
yes.
When you were talking about, because my experience with working with Japanese actors there, I know of Senenza as a company in Japan, and because they train their own actors, they all they set up, so they have this company, but they set up kind of a school, an acting school, and they train them on a very much like the Stanislavski method, you need to kind of sign up to their school, and carry on with the company. And there are other companies like that, like One Two Works, like Caramel Box, that they do set up their own kind of like training school because of the lack of the the general education there. So now, what was the other question?
What effect it's had on you? Has it changed the way you work, the way you see yourself as a director?
Yeah, inevitably. I think it changes both sides, when you start working together. I think when I first went to Japan, I found the rehearsal room so rigid in how, everything has to be kept, and for me, at the beginning was quite a battle in that sense. It was like, why so much rigidity? Why have to be so, the flexibility, the kind of like the organic way of working was not quite there. The improvisations that I had to, and I brought in a lot of that to them, and vice versa. I learned from the rigidity as well. Sometimes that rigidity was quite good to have, so it put me in place. So I think that exchange, I think we both grow, as artists.
And Yojiro, you also have a foot very much in both worlds. I mean, how is it changing you as you develop as a director?
So maybe my answer will be the one like seeing it from the other perspective. But when I started my career in Japan, I belonged to Shiki Theater Company, which has really, really strict hierarchy in there. So just as Frank said, there's they're really strict. I mean, that there's this big director on the top, and then we have to obey everything he says. So it was so difficult. I mean, it's not so creative environment, I would say. But then when I came here, it's just it opened my eyes, how theater can be flexible, how theater can be creative, and how you have to be open to just, to open up to connect with people and all these things. So, and also this is really interesting thing is that it was not until that I came here that I started to think that how unique the Japanese culture is. Because if you're living within the culture, it's quite difficult to, I mean, you only think it is something dated. Do you know what I mean? It's something old and something boring. However, once you go out, once you leave the country, you start to see it objectively. And then and also what I realized is that how all these culture, traditional cultural material essences and materials and all these things are actually existing within me. Maybe it is imprinted in DNA, I don't know. But and then as a theater director, I started to use all these things to create something new, at the same time, merging it with Western culture thing. So yes, I mean, my answer to your question is that yes, I mean, it changed how I work so much.
Picking up on that, though, I remember speaking to directors such as Terayama back in the 1980s, who seemed to say he hated kabuki theater because it was a museum piece. And a lot of directors, particularly in the avant-garde Japanese theater, seem to have a love-hate relationship with the great traditions. They hated it because of its constriction, but they also drew on it as an inspiration in their work. Do you feel some of that contradiction yourself?
Yes, actually, yes. Because one of the frustrations I have as a theater artist is that what people would appreciate, what Western people appreciate as Japanese theater is that how visually exotic it is, and which for example, all the productions done in here, all the production directed by Ninagawa done in here, they have this Japanese design, and then that's mainly what people always praise. But most important thing about Japanese theater is that the philosophy and mentality we have, and also the way we find value and meaning in this emptiness, simplicity, all these kind of things. It's just so different from how people think in the Western world. But so the thing I really want to do as a theater person is that how to introduce things, not in a traditional way, but how to, in a way that it is still relevant and accessible by the Western people, but still trying to convey all these messages and philosophy from our culture.
And Alex, how do you deal with that? I mean, there you are in the middle of it, coping with all these wild bouncing around actors and all that energy. Has it changed you as a director?
It's changed my life. It's really cliche, but it's true. I came out here the experience of being here and being able to have the privilege of working with something like a Studio Ghibli film, what was life-changing. And I decided at that, when I came back, well, I've got to get back. And not only have I got to get back, I've got to find a way of staying there and actually trying to pick up some of the language. So it definitely has. And in terms of my practice, I find the time that I've been here, I'm continually learning about how the concept of Japaneseness is kind of a construct, and depending on where you first encountered it, I think depends on how you experience it. And it's that's one reason it's interesting to work with anime or manga, because I think me, like so many others, my first encounter with Japan was through Japanese animation. And it's like when you go to the kabuki, I've always appreciated it for the things that Yojiro-san was talking about, the design and the way the movement tells the story, but I never really could tap into the story for a while. But then after many viewings, there was kind of a moment where it clicked in that this is just a different script. There's a different way of presenting stories and emotion, and you need to sort of spend some time getting to understand that in order to realize that there's not only one way of doing this, and there's so much light and shade within all of it. It's just the initial approach is quite different, with kabuki using so much song and music and movement, and in a very sort of quote unquote stylized manner, as compared to something that might be more text-based in traditional English theatre. And it's completely eye-opening, and I'm very grateful for the welcome I've had from Japanese people.
It seems you're all very lucky to be able to work in an intimate, direct way across different cultures, of putting, from where you're coming, approaching a different culture. What advice would you have for other directors who would like to explore this more, to open themselves to stories from other cultures, Japanese stories? We've had one question, I think from Joe O'Connell, said, should we be seeing Western adaptations of kabuki and no theatre? That's another question of the style. Can we import the style rather than the story? But what do you think? Should we try to bring more of these stories and cultures into our theatre to enrich it? What advice would you have for other directors? Anyone? That's a no. Alex,
if no one else.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it's just like, how do you go about it? If you just very briefly, what advice would you give to somebody who needed to be open to that culture?
I think that exactly what you just said, be open, I think is the biggest thing. I think doing what you can to acquaint yourself with the authenticity of the project. So I would say the biggest thing you can do is work with a Japanese producer or Japanese artist, Japanese actors. If you haven't got any direct experience yourself, or even if you do, I think that's one of the most powerful things. And also I think with regards to specifically to kabuki, because that's so steeped in tradition, and you have to be born into a kabuki family, and you have to be male. That's how it works still in Japan, and that's a fascinating thing to see. But it's extremely costly, and it has been done, but I think it's not something that British performers could do without serious training if you wanted to get an authentic sense of it. Not that we should put any boundaries on what you can and cannot do, but I think that would be extremely challenging.
Any other advice? Franco, you are working with young directors, encouraging them, aren't you?
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, I mean, I think it's really kind of like trying to be as respectful and ethical as you can, within the boundaries of, because it's so easy to go into the fetishizing something to,
the exoticism.
Yeah, I mean, going to that side. So I think you really need to be, really sensitive to, all this story. For me, like I said earlier, for me, it's the story. That I have to tell that story. What's the best story? Which tell story. But I think when we're dealing with everything else, I think you need to be very careful who you bring. I mean, when we worked, like I wanted to, in the past when I was trying to, there was a scene in Hanjo where she's waiting for the train, and I was trying to recreate a moment which that Mishima translated, which is from the noise, a movement piece from the noise, and I needed to have someone, an actor who could do that, could only be a Japanese no trained actor could do that scene. And so my casting was very limited for that, particular character. So, but I just thinking, I think you need to be very sensitive, because I mean, if otherwise it can look like a bad copy, or it can you lose the actual message of what you're trying to to convey, and the aesthetic of it. If you're following that aesthetic, if you're trying to work with that kind of aesthetic, I think you really need to then really think about very carefully, be sensitive about the work that you're approaching.
Yojiro, would you agree with that?
Yes, I think so. And also I agree with what Alex said. It's just like you have to be open for everything, I guess, because like talking about myself, I started my career in musical theater. So like when I came here, I mean, just like, the way I thought things was like really, really limited. However, then I started to, work with people from different genres, and that's opened up, I mean, that's broadened my horizon so much. So what I would say is that, and also this is something really interesting I found here, so that, so the people working in drama, they tend to say, musical theater is not a proper theater. And then the people in musical theater tend to say that people in straight theater, they are just like so boring. And then like physical theater people who tend to say like, we're doing the most interesting thing in the world. So, but however, like we're all theater people. So like you have to open for everything, and then you have to jump in and then challenge things. And then that would broaden your like capacity, broaden your horizon to be more, how should I say, to be a theater artist that's capable of more things. I believe. Yeah.
Jeremy, any final words of advice for other directors who would like to look at other cultures, such as Japan?
I think it's about, I mean, I'm very conscious that I'm not doing a Japanese story. And if I did, I don't know whether I would be qualified to present that. As far as I'm concerned, the place that the dead go to in our show of Afterlife is just outside Reading, with a diverse company of actors that reflects London in 2021. Yes, the source material is from a Japanese film, so I would caution people to be very careful about stepping into other cultural artifacts, and to really consider, the reason why something feels like a good thing to adapt. Is it genuinely universal enough to transcend its original iteration and to make a leap into another culture, and indeed into another form, and cross your fingers that it is. But I think, I agree with everybody else that the making of art is about conversation and collaboration and openness, and acknowledging one's own limitations and one's own ability to be amazed and educated. And the best work comes through that energy and with that spirit. So rather like this discussion and this wonderful group of people sending all the questions that we don't have time to answer, it's about a conversation and about being open and listening. So thank you everybody for your engagement.
And thank you all of you for your contribution to that. We hope that we can look at international theatre, other cultures in a new way, find a stimulus for that, and to keep the cross-fertilization going for the enrichment of theatre. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful discussion, and it's actually, in fact, so much sort of food for thought in the future, I'm sure. I myself have been sort of, thinking about quite a long time. When we have the Japanese theater or Japan-related sort of theater production in this country, whether it is going to be, pursuing for universality, like Jeremy said, or it has to be really obviously Japanese. As a kind of sort of, the organization promotes Japanese culture, of course, it's easier for us to be associated with that something very Japanese, obviously, but nonetheless, that it may, there may be, there will be some danger that it's just only one-off. It won't be actually going down with people, audience, or even professional people. So this kind of discussion should be going on, for the many years to come. And I wish you all, director, good luck. And I was very fortunate to be, to have opportunity to see all of your production. So I was really intrigued, what you have, said about behind the scenes. So thank you so much. And also thanks goes to Kenneth, handling this conversation so well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope that everybody enjoy it. And then there is something you can, you'll be able to take it away from this round discussion. And I hope that similar discussion is, going on somewhere with us or with somebody. And then think about that, what it's like to have that, bringing that to have a production, associated with a different culture, if not just only Japan, but many culture, because we are living in that multi-culture, city in London and the UK. So thank you so much, and then I hope you have a nice evening, and then Darian will send you that questionnaire today or tomorrow. So please, complete the questionnaire. Thank you so much. So
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Thank you, Junko.
Bye-bye.
Can I just say well done to Alex for staying up in the middle of the night?
Yes.
Thank you for.
I hope I made sense.
Indeed, yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.